Welcome back to another journey into the depths of Frank Herbert's magnificent universe. Tonight, we're exploring the intricate political machinery that keeps the known universe functioning, the grand halls where dynasties rise and fall, where a single vote can determine the fate of entire planetary systems. We're talking about the great houses of Dune, the Landsraad that binds them together, and the ancient feuds that threaten to tear everything apart. This is the hidden architecture of power that makes the story of Paul Atreides possible. Before we dive into the corridors of power on Kitane and the smoking wastelands of Giedi Prime, if you enjoy these deep explorations of science fiction's greatest universes, hitting that subscribe button really helps the channel grow and lets me know you want more content like this. Now, settle in as we unravel the complex political web that Herbert wove across 10,000 years of fictional history. The foundation of imperial power. To understand the great houses, you first need to understand the world they inhabit. The known universe of Dune operates under a feudal system so old, so entrenched, that questioning it would be like questioning gravity itself. This is the Falfreluches, which translates roughly to a place for every person and every person in their place. It's a rigid class structure enforced across thousands of worlds, maintained by tradition, military might, and economic necessity. Imagine looking out across the galaxy and seeing not nations or republics or democracies, but a vast feudal empire where bloodline determines everything, where your great-great-great-grandfather's actions 10,000 years ago still affect your standing today, where houses can rise from nothing to control entire star systems or fall from grace so completely that their names are erased from history. This is the universe Herbert created, a future that looks strangely like humanity's past. At the apex of this pyramid sits the Padishah Emperor, currently Shaddam Carino IV, 81st of his line to occupy the Golden Lion throne. House Carino has ruled the known universe for over 10 millennia, maintaining power through a combination of political cunning, economic control, and the most devastating military force ever assembled, the Sardaukar. These warrior fanatics, trained on the prison planet Seleucia Secundus, are so fearsome that it's said only the combined forces of all the great houses together could hope to defeat them. But here's the thing about absolute power. It's never actually absolute. The emperor might sit on the Golden Lion throne, might command the Sardaukar, might have his name spoken with reverence across 1,000,000 worlds, but he doesn't rule alone. He can't. The galaxy is too vast, the interests too complex, the competing powers too numerous. And this is where the Landsraad enters the picture. The Landsraad is the Great Assembly, the Council of Councils, the body that represents all the noble houses of the Imperium. Think of it as a combination of the medieval European Parliament, a corporate shareholders meeting, and a knife fight in a darkened room. Every great house has a seat here. Every great house has a vote. And through this body, the houses collectively wield enough power to check even the emperor himself. This creates what one character describes as a three-point civilization, an unstable tripod of power. You have the imperial household on one leg, the federated great houses of the Landsraad on another, and standing between them, holding the whole thing together through its monopoly on space travel, the Spacing Guild. Each needs the others, each fears the others, each constantly maneuvers against the others while pretending cooperation. It's a system designed to prevent any single entity from achieving total dominance, and it's worked for 10,000 years. Barely. But there's a fourth power, one that doesn't announce itself, that prefers to work in shadows and through proxies. The Bene Gesserit Sisterhood, with their genetic breeding programs spanning millennia, their ability to read and manipulate human behavior with terrifying precision, their own long-term plans for humanity's future. They hold shares in Chom, the economic engine of the Imperium. They place their sisters as wives, concubines, and advisors in every great house. They see everything, influence everything, and answer to no one but themselves. When people speak of the three-point civilization, the Bene Gesserit simply smile and say nothing. The Landsraad, where power speaks. The Landsraad predates even the Carino Empire. Its roots stretch back more than 12,000 years to a time before the Butlerian Jihad, before humanity's great war against thinking machines. Back then it was called the League of Nobles, a slightly more democratic body where representatives were actually elected, where the people had at least some say in who governed them. But after the Jihad, after Fakan Carino seized power and declared himself first Padishah Emperor, the League transformed into the Landsraad we know from the books. The transformation was subtle but profound. The new Landsraad kept the structure, kept the voting, kept the appearance of checks and balances, but it became more rigidly feudal, more focused on bloodline than merit, more concerned with maintaining the power of existing noble houses than with representing the common people. The great houses, those families powerful enough to rule entire planets or even star systems, gained voting privileges. The minor houses, smaller dynasties that might control cities or continents but not entire worlds, received reduced voting power. And everyone else? The billions upon billions of regular people living their lives across 1 million planets? They got nothing. No vote, no voice. Just the requirement to obey whoever ruled the world they happened to live on. Let's talk about how this voting system actually works, because it's fascinatingly complex. The Landsraad doesn't operate on a simple one house, one vote principle. Instead, votes are distributed based on power, wealth, and influence, creating a weighted system that's constantly in flux. According to the historical records, the structure breaks down something like this. The Imperial House, meaning House Carino, holds 100 votes as its base allocation, plus an additional 100 votes given to the emperor personally. This gives the throne 200 votes right from the start, making it the single most powerful voice in the assembly. But here's the crucial detail. The combined voting power of all the great houses totals 400 votes, double what the emperor controls alone. And the minor houses, through their representatives, also command 400 votes. Now you might think this means the emperor is badly outnumbered, that the houses could simply vote together and override anything the throne wants to do. And you'd be right, theoretically. But theory and practice are very different things. The great houses are never united. Never. They're too busy feuding with each other, competing for chome directorships, plotting revenge for insults delivered generations ago, jockeying for position and prestige. Getting them to agree on anything is like herding cats. Hungry, paranoid, heavily armed cats that have been feuding for centuries. The emperor knows this. The emperor counts on this. Imperial policy for 10,000 years has been divide and conquer, playing the great houses against each other, making sure no coalition ever becomes powerful enough to threaten the throne. Give House Harkonnen control of Arrakis and let them grow fat on spice profits for 80 years. Then take it away and give it to House Atreides, a house growing dangerously popular in the Landsraad. Watch the Harkonnens and Atreides destroy each other, while you benefit from whoever wins. It's a strategy that's worked for millennia. The Spacing Guild, that mysterious organization of mutated navigators who make interstellar travel possible, also holds 100 votes in the Landsraad. Technically, they're not a great house, but their monopoly on space travel gives them leverage that transcends traditional power structures. They never vote. They never take sides in house disputes. They maintain strict neutrality in all political matters, focused entirely on ensuring the free flow of commerce and the supply of melange, the spice that lets their navigators fold space. But everyone knows that if the guild ever chose to use those 100 votes, if they ever allied with the great houses against the emperor, or vice versa, the balance would shatter completely. The Landsraad meets regularly on Khitan, the imperial capital, in a building that's part parliament, part fortress, part arena. Here, the houses relate with one another, as the official language delicately puts it. They negotiate trade agreements worth billions of solari. They form alliances through marriage, joining bloodlines to create new power blocks. They declare Canley, the formal feuds that let them settle scores without endangering innocence. They bring accusations before the High Council, demanding justice for wrongs both real and imagined. They scheme, they plot, they make deals in shadowed alcoves that can change the fate of worlds. The High Council is the inner circle, the real power within the Landsraad. Not every great house sits on the council. Only the most influential, the most powerful, the most important houses earn seats here. During the time of Shaddam IV, somewhere between 35 and 100 great houses held council positions, though the exact number fluctuated with the political and economic fortunes of various dynasties. The council empowers itself to act as supreme tribunal in disputes between houses. They decide whether formal declarations of vendetta are valid. They can strip a house of its status, redistribute its assets, even decree that an entire bloodline be exiled to Tupili, the banishment world where disgraced houses go to fade into obscurity. But perhaps the most interesting figure in the whole Landsraad structure is the Judge of Change. This is a position of tremendous authority and equally tremendous delicacy. The judge oversees matters like Canley negotiations, changes of fiefdoms, and wars of assassins. They're supposed to be non-partisan, objective arbiters who serve justice without fear or favor. In reality, they're often instruments of imperial policy, appointed with the emperor's approval, influenced by Chom interests, pressured by the most powerful houses. Still, the position exists, and sometimes, very rarely, a judge of change actually does their job with integrity. And when that happens, it can change everything. The great houses, blood and iron. So what exactly makes a great house great? What separates them from the minor houses, the lesser dynasties, the countless noble families scattered across the Imperium? It's not just wealth, though wealth is certainly important. It's not just military power, though that matters too. A great house needs several things working together, a combination of factors that marks them as worthy of a seat in the Landsraad and a stake in Chom. First, they need territory. Specifically, they need what's called a Siridar fief, meaning direct control of at least one planet of moderate value, or several planets of lesser importance. A great house doesn't govern these worlds on behalf of someone else. They own them, at least as much as anyone can own a planet in the feudal system. The emperor grants the fief, but once granted, the house has enormous latitude in how they govern. They collect taxes, they make laws, they raise armies, they build cities and industries and trade networks. The planet is theirs, to nurture or exploit as they see fit. Duke Leto Atreides held Caladan for 26 generations, an oceanic paradise where House Atreides had perfected a form of government that resulted in, as the histories put it, a well-organized society and spiritually satisfied people. The Atreides kept Caladan green and prosperous, with relatively low industrial levels, focusing on agriculture and sustainable fishing. They ruled with a light hand, earned genuine loyalty from their subjects, and became known across the Landsraad for their just governance. Meanwhile, Baron Vladimir Harkonnen ruled Giddy Prime, and the contrast couldn't be more stark. Giddy Prime orbited a black sun that turned everything monochrome. But the real darkness came from within. The Harkonnens built an industrial hell world, covering the planet in factories and refineries and slave pens. They governed through fear, through casual brutality, through the certainty that any sign of weakness would be punished with creative cruelty. The planet made them rich. It also made them hated. But the Harkonnens never cared about being loved, only about being feared and wealthy. Second, a great house needs what the records call an understanding of political processes and power, and a desire to participate in the governance of the empire. This is code for political sophistication, the ability to play the great game of houses without being immediately destroyed. You need mentats, those human computers trained to think with mechanical precision. You need a master of assassins to defend against threats and occasionally strike at enemies. You need spies in other houses, informants in the right places, the ability to gather intelligence and act on it decisively. You need to understand when to make alliances and when to break them, when to seek vengeance and when to let an insult pass, when to push for advantage and when to consolidate what you already have. The great houses that survive and prosper are the ones that master this art. Houses that don't, that act rashly or trust too easily, or fail to see threats until they're already destroyed. Those houses fall. Their assets get redistributed. Their names become cautionary tales. The Landsraad is a brutal proving ground, and it doesn't forgive weakness. Third, a great house needs historical legitimacy, what the formal requirements call historical growth of their houses as evidenced by grants of land or titles. You can't just show up with a lot of money and declare yourself a great house. Well, you can try, and some minor houses do exactly that. But true great house status requires pedigree. Your family needs to have earned its place over generations, accumulated grants from previous emperors, demonstrated staying power across centuries or millennia. The newest great houses are still typically hundreds of years old. Many, like House Atreides and House Harkonnen, trace their lineage back 10,000 years to the Butlerian Jihad itself. This emphasis on bloodline creates stability, but also stagnation. The same families tend to remain in power generation after generation. A peasant, no matter how talented or intelligent, has essentially zero chance of rising to lead a great house. The best they could hope for would be to enter service to a great house, perhaps rise to become a mentat or sword master, achieve personal success without ever threatening the fundamental order. The system is designed to maintain itself, to ensure that those who have power keep it. But there's a fourth factor, harder to define but absolutely crucial. The records call it a certain éclat, which is difficult to define, but which nonetheless remained the hallmark of all the houses attaining this status. This is about presence, reputation, the intangible quality that makes other houses sit up and pay attention when you speak. Duke Leto Atreides had it. His popularity in the Landsraad grew so strong that the Emperor himself felt threatened. People actually liked the Atreides, admired their principled governance, hoped to see more houses follow their example. That kind of soft power, that moral authority, It's worth more than a dozen planets. The Baron Harkonnen had his own version, not admiration, but fear. Everyone knew the Harkonnens would do anything to win, that they had no principles beyond accumulating power and wealth. You didn't ally with the Harkonnens because you liked them. You allied with them because you were more afraid of having them as enemies than as friends. That reputation, that aura of casual menace, it opened doors that moral authority never could. Most great houses maintained standing armies that rivaled the best forces in the Imperium. During the height of the Carino Empire, it was said that combining all the great house militaries would create a force roughly equal to the Emperor's Sardaukar. This wasn't coincidence. It was deliberate. The great houses made sure they collectively could resist the throne, that the Emperor couldn't simply conquer them one by one, but they also made sure they stayed divided, that no coalition ever got strong enough to actually challenge for the throne itself. These armies weren't just for show. The great houses used them constantly, fighting their endless wars of assassins, defending their territories, occasionally conquering new worlds when opportunities presented themselves. They maintained sword masters, warriors trained at the legendary school on Ginaz, masters of blade work who served as both military leaders and personal bodyguards to the noble families. They employed war masters to plan campaigns, mentats to calculate logistics and probabilities, elite forces trained in techniques that approached the abilities of the Sardaukar themselves. Duke Leto Atreides, in the months before moving to Arrakis, had managed to train a small elite force that was genuinely comparable to the Imperial Sardaukar. This was extraordinarily dangerous. If the Emperor had known the full extent of Atreides' military capabilities, the attack on Arrakis might have come even sooner, with even more force. As it was, Shaddam sent 5 legions of his own Sardaukar disguised as Harkonnen troops to make absolutely certain the Atreides were destroyed. He couldn't risk them surviving, couldn't risk them continuing to build power and popularity. Chom, the real prize. We need to talk about Chom because nothing in the Imperium matters quite like Chom. The Combine Honate Ober Advancer Mercantiles is officially a development corporation. In practice, it's the beating heart of the galactic economy, the mechanism through which virtually all interstellar trade flows. Chom touches everything. Art from Ekaz, machines from Rishis and Ix, whale fur from Lankavale, Pundi rice from Caladan, and of course, always and above all, the spice melange from Arrakis. Frank Herbert once compared Chom to OPEC, the real-world oil cartel, and the comparison is apt. Just as OPEC controlled petroleum prices and availability in the 20th century, Chom controls the flow of goods across the known universe. But Chom is more. It's also a political instrument, a way of distributing power and wealth according to a formula that keeps the Imperium functioning. Chom's structure mirrors that of a modern corporation, but one where all the shareholders are nobles and the stock can't be traded on any open market. The Imperial House, the Landsraad, the Spacing Guild, and the Bene Gesserit all hold shares, but not equally. The Emperor holds the largest single block of shares, giving him enormous influence over CHOAM policy. The great houses collectively hold more, but again they're divided and competitive, rarely voting in unison. The Guild and the Sisterhood maintain their positions as silent partners, not agitating for control, but ensuring their interests are protected. The real prize isn't just holding shares in CHOAM, it's gaining a directorship. CHOAM directors don't just collect dividends, they actively shape economic policy, decide which products get priority for guild transport, influence the flow of spice, skim profits in ways that the official books never quite capture. A CHOAM directorship can turn a moderately wealthy house into a genuinely rich one. Losing a directorship can be financially devastating. The Emperor can grant and revoke directorships more or less at whim, though doing so too arbitrarily risks antagonizing the Landsraad. During the events of the first Dune novel, Baron Harkonnen held only a temporary CHOAM directorship. This uncertainty gnawed at him, drove much of his scheming. When he allied with the Emperor to destroy House Atreides, part of his reward was supposed to be a permanent directorship, an irrevocable seat at the table of real power. It was worth betraying every principle of the Great Convention, worth sending an entire house to destruction, worth risking his own nephews in combat. Duke Leto gained a formal CHOAM directorship through his marriage to Lady Helena Riches, though his relationship with her was reportedly cold. The directorship was important enough to maintain the marriage despite personal unhappiness. Later, when Leto's concubine, Lady Jessica, gave birth to Paul, the situation became incredibly delicate. Paul was technically a bastard, not a legitimate heir, precisely because Leto couldn't divorce Helena without losing the CHOAM connection. Politics and economics dictated even the most intimate family decisions. When Paul Atreides seized the imperial throne, one of his first acts was consolidating control over CHOAM. He didn't just inherit the Emperor's shares. He systematically gathered directorships, called in favors, used the threat of his Fremen armies to pressure houses into granting him their proxies. Within a few years, Paul controlled CHOAM more completely than any emperor in history. Combined with his direct control of Arrakis and its spice, this made him the most economically powerful human being who had ever lived. All that wealth and power, and it still couldn't save him from the terrible future he saw coming. The formation of CHOAM itself is worth understanding. 80 years after the Butlerian Jihad, when humanity had defeated the thinking machines and was struggling to rebuild interstellar civilization, trade had collapsed into a dark age. Without computers to navigate folded space, travel between stars was impossibly dangerous. Entire planets found themselves cut off, their economies isolated, their people slowly reverting to pre-space technology. Then the Spacing Guild emerged, revealing that they'd discovered a way to navigate folded space safely using guild navigators, humans so transformed by massive spice consumption that they could see safe paths through dimensions that destroyed unaltered human minds. Suddenly, interstellar travel became possible again. But the Guild demanded a price. They would maintain absolute neutrality in all political conflicts. They would transport anyone who could pay their fees, and they wanted a share in the economic recovery they were enabling. Emperor Saudir I recognized that the Guild's monopoly on space travel gave them leverage that could break the Imperium. He called a financial synod on Aurarium IV, bringing together representatives of the Imperial House, the Landsraad, and the Guild. Out of this synod came Chom, a structure designed to bind all the major powers together through shared economic interest. If everyone profits from Chom, the thinking went, everyone has a stake in maintaining peace and preventing the kind of total war that could shatter interstellar civilization again. The arrangement gave the Emperor only 20% of Chom's shares, far less than Saudir probably wanted. But it also meant that no single great house could control Chom without imperial support. The voting structure ensured that maintaining power required coalition building, required the emperor to cultivate allies in the Landsraad, required the great houses to compete for imperial favor. Chom became the primary arena where the great game of politics and economics merged into a single contest for wealth and influence. Conley, the ritualized feud. The Great Convention, that historic treaty brokered after the Butlerian Jihad, established several fundamental laws that every house in the Imperium must obey. The most famous provision prohibits using atomics against human targets. Violation means total destruction, not just of the offending house, but of their homeworld, their allies, everyone connected to them. The thinking machines had nearly destroyed humanity. The convention ensured humans would never again face extinction through atomic warfare, even if it meant sacrificing entire noble bloodlines as examples. But the convention did more than ban atomics. It also established the rules for how houses could legally fight each other, creating a framework for vendetta that spared innocent bystanders while letting noble houses settle their scores. This framework had two levels, Conley and the War of Assassins. Conley is the formal feud, the declared vendetta between two great houses. When one house has been grievously wronged by another, when insults cannot be overlooked, when blood demands blood, the head of the aggrieved house can declare Conley. This declaration must be made publicly, notifying the Landsraad High Council, the Imperial Court, and the head of the house being declared against. Once declared, a judge of the right is appointed to supervise negotiations between the feuding houses. Here's what makes Conley fascinating. It's not immediately violent. The Declaration of Conley opens a negotiation period where the houses, with only the judge present as witness, attempt to resolve their differences. Sometimes this means financial compensation, a transfer of territory or Chom holdings, a marriage alliance that binds the houses together and prevents future conflict. Sometimes it means nothing can satisfy except personal combat. When negotiations fail, when both houses remain unwilling to compromise, Conley is settled by the blade. The heads of the houses or their chosen representatives meet in ritual combat. Knives only, no shields, no tricks. Fight until one party dies or yields. If the defeated party dies, their heir can choose to continue the Conley or withdraw it, ending the feud. In particularly bitter Conley, where hate runs deep enough, houses sometimes wipe out all each other's heirs, fighting generation after generation until one bloodline is completely exterminated. When a house is destroyed through Conley, The Great Convention has provisions to prevent the victorious house from simply seizing everything. The judge of the right redistributes the losing house's assets, with the winning house receiving only a small portion. The crown takes a much larger share, ostensibly to support the losing house's survivors. This parsimony is deliberate. It prevents Conley from becoming a profitable way to do business, ensures that houses declare Conley only when they truly cannot resolve their differences any other way. The War of Assassins operates differently. This is covert conflict, shadow warfare, conducted according to strict rules laid out in the Assassin's Handbook. Unlike Canley, which is public and ritual, a war of assassins can be conducted quietly, with the broader Imperium never knowing which houses are feuding. The goal is to reduce involvement of innocent bystanders, to let houses kill each other without bringing their populations into direct conflict. Great houses employing mentat assassins to conduct these wars. Brilliant minds trained in both advanced computational thinking and the art of murder. Peter de Vries served Baron Harkonnen in this capacity. Thufir Hawat performed the same role for Duke Leto Atreides. These mentat assassins plan operations that can take years to bear fruit. They infiltrate enemy households. They corrupt officials. They discover weaknesses and exploit them. They deploy poison and hunter-seekers and suborned souk doctors. They kill, but they kill precisely, eliminating targets while leaving infrastructure intact. The most famous War of Assassins is obviously the Harkonnen-Atreides conflict, which culminated in the Siege of Arrakeen and the near destruction of House Atreides. But this war was compromised from the beginning. The Emperor secretly supported the Harkonnens with 5 legions of Sardaukar disguised in Harkonnen uniforms. This violated every principle of the War of Assassins, which is supposed to be between the feuding houses alone, without outside interference. But Shaddam IV wanted the Atreides destroyed quickly and completely, and he was willing to break the rules to make it happen. When Paul Atreides challenged Feyd-Rautha Harkonnen to single combat in the Emperor's presence, he was invoking Canley in its most traditional form. 2 men, 2 knives, fighting to settle a feud that had consumed their families for 10,000 years. The Emperor himself served as judge of the right, the only recorded instance of this happening in Imperial history. Paul knew Feyd would cheat. Everyone knew Feyd would cheat. The Harkonnens always cheated, but Paul fought anyway. Killed Feyd anyway, ended both the formal Canley and the War of Assassins in a single brutal combat. The most tragic aspect of Canley is how it perpetuates across generations. A Canley declared by your grandfather becomes your Canley. An insult given 300 years ago still demands satisfaction today. Children grow up knowing which houses are their sworn enemies, which bloodlines they're duty-bound to hate, which families they must destroy given the opportunity. The feuds become part of house identity, woven into family histories, taught to each generation as proudly as the achievements and honors. This generational hatred reaches its apex in the Atreides-Harkonnen feud, but it's hardly unique. House Moritani and House Ginaz fought for generations. eventually resulting in Ginaz's defeat and virtual extinction. House Moritani and House Ikaz maintained their own vendetta, with attacks and counterattacks stretching across decades. When Duke Leto led a raid on Giedi Prime to destroy Baron Harkonnen's secret spice hoards, he was continuing military operations that Atreides and Harkonnen commanders had been conducting for centuries. The specific reasons for each raid might change, but the underlying enmity remained constant. The 10,000-year feud, Atreides and Harkonnen. No story of the great houses would be complete without examining the blood feud that defines Dune's narrative, the bitter enmity between House Atreides and House Harkonnen. This isn't just backdrop. It's the engine driving everything that happens on Arrakis. The reason Paul's family ends up on the desert planet in the first place. The foundation for 10,000 years of accumulated hate. The feud begins at the Battle of Corrin, the final engagement of the Butlerian Jihad. The thinking machines, led by the computer Evermind Omnius, made their last stand on the planet Corrin. The League of Nobles brought the full might of humanity's remaining military forces to destroy this final bastion of artificial intelligence. Victory meant ending the centuries-long war. Defeat meant extinction. During the battle, the thinking machines revealed their final desperate tactic. They'd surrounded Corrin with cargo pods containing human slaves, millions of captives taken throughout the war. This became known as the Bridge of Hrethgir. Any attack on Corrin would kill these helpless prisoners. The League's leaders faced an impossible choice: sacrifice millions of innocents to destroy the machines, or hold back and risk prolonging the war indefinitely. Vorian Atreides, Supreme Bashar of the Army of Humanity, the military commander of all League forces, made the terrible decision to attack anyway. Millions of innocent humans died to destroy Omnius and win the Jihad. Abelard Harkonnen, his second-in-command and grandson of Vorian's closest friend, refused to obey the order. He tried to stop the attack, to save the prisoners, and in doing so arguably betrayed his oath and endangered the entire war effort. After the battle, after the victory that cost so many innocent lives, Vorian publicly exposed Abelard's disobedience. He branded him a coward and a traitor before the assembled leaders of humanity. Abelard was stripped of rank, expelled from the military, and exiled to the frozen planet Lankavale, a harsh world where his descendants would spend generations in obscurity. But worse than the exile was the name. Vorian swore that forever after, his descendants and all who remembered the Jihad would spit upon the name Harkonnen. It was a curse that echoed across centuries. Now here's where the feud becomes truly tragic. Neither man was wrong. Vorian saw the larger picture, understood that defeating the thinking machines was worth almost any price, that if humanity lost the Jihad, there would be no innocence left to save. Abelard saw the immediate human cost, refused to murder millions of helpless prisoners for strategic advantage, held true to the principle that human life is sacred. Both men acted according to deeply held convictions. Both men did what they thought was right, and their conflict created a blood feud that would consume hundreds of thousands of lives across the next 10 millennia. Abelard's descendants learned to hate the name Atreides with the intensity that only the wrongly shamed can muster. They believed their ancestor had been right, that Vorian Atreides had been a butcher who massacred innocents and then blamed Abelard for refusing to participate in the slaughter. They taught this version of history to their children, who taught it to their children, until hatred of the Atreides became as fundamental to Harkonnen identity as their own names. The Atreides, for their part, remembered Abelard as the coward, who nearly cost humanity victory in its greatest war. Every Atreides child learned about the Battle of Corinne, learned that a Harkonnen had refused his duty at the most crucial moment in human history, learned that the Harkonnen name itself meant treachery and cowardice. This too passed down through generations, becoming part of the Atreides bloodline's foundation. By the time we reach the events of Dune, both houses have been conducting their feud for so long that nobody remembers exactly why it started anymore. They know there was betrayal at Corinne. They know one house wronged the other terribly. But the specific details have been lost or distorted by 10,000 years of retelling and revision. What matters now is the hate itself, the certainty that the other house is fundamentally dishonorable, that any Atreides Harkonnen interaction will end in betrayal and blood. The feud manifested in countless ways over the millennia. Atreides and Harkonnen representatives voted against each other reflexively in the Landsraad, regardless of the actual merits of any proposal. They competed for the same Chone directorships, the same imperial favors, the same trade routes and planetary fiefs. They conducted raids and counter-raids, wars of assassins that flared up whenever one house saw an opportunity to damage the other. They spread rumors, corrupted each other's officials, assassinated key personnel, engaged in every form of shadow warfare that the Great Convention permitted. But for most of those 10,000 years, the feud remained relatively contained. Neither house could destroy the other, and neither wanted to invest the resources necessary to try. The Atreides held Caladan, a moderate world that kept them comfortable but not excessively wealthy. The Harkonnens held Giedi Prime, and for 80 years before the events of the first novel, they also held Arrakis, the desert planet whose spice made them one of the richest houses in the Imperium. The power balance, while heavily favoring the Harkonnens economically, included
the fact that the Atreides were far more popular in the Landsraad, far more trusted, far more likely to find allies if open war ever came. Duke Leto Atreides represented everything his house valued. He was just, governing Caladan with a fairness that earned genuine loyalty from his subjects. He was brave, personally leading troops in combat when necessary, never asking his men to face dangers he wouldn't share. He was principled, adhering to a moral code even when breaking it would have been profitable. His concubine, Jessica, loved him. His men would die for him. His son, Paul, was growing into a young man of remarkable abilities, trained as both Mentat and potential Bene Gesserit, though the latter training was supposed to have been secret. Most importantly, Duke Leto was popular in the Landsraad. Other great houses respected him, saw in him an example of what noble governance should look like. Some even whispered that Leto would make a better emperor than Shaddam, that if the great houses ever chose to replace House Carino, House Atreides would be the natural choice. These whispers were dangerous. The emperor heard them, and they terrified him. Baron Vladimir Harkonnen represented his house's opposite virtues. He was cunning, probably the most devious political mind of his generation. He was ruthless, willing to do literally anything to advance his house's interests. He was patient when necessary, capable of planning operations that would take years to mature. And he was utterly without moral constraints, viewing honor and justice as weaknesses that more scrupulous houses suffered from. The Baron's appetites were legendary and disturbing. He indulged in pleasures that would have destroyed the reputation of any house that cared about reputation. He maintained a stable of young men for his predatory desires, discarding them when he tired of them or when they disappointed him. He ate and drank to excess, his body growing so obese that he required suspensor technology just to move, floating through the air on anti-gravity devices while his bulk sagged beneath him. But this self-indulgence never affected his scheming. The Baron's mind remained sharp, always calculating, always looking for angles and opportunities. The Baron's nephews represented two different potential futures for House Harkonnen. Glossu Rabban, called Beast Rabban, was a blunt instrument, useful for intimidation and brutal suppression, but lacking the subtlety needed to truly rule. Feyd-Rautha Rabban was everything the Baron hoped to cultivate. Intelligent, sadistic in precisely calibrated ways, handsome enough to be popular while remaining vicious enough to hold power through fear. The Baron planned to have Rabban rule Arrakis so badly, extracting so much wealth through such cruel methods, that when Feyd eventually replaced him, the people would welcome their new oppressor as a liberating hero. It was a plan worthy of the Harkonnen reputation for Byzantine scheming. When Emperor Shaddam IV decided to destroy House Atreides, he needed a proxy. He couldn't simply send the Sardaukar openly. That would unite the Landsraad against him, potentially triggering exactly the kind of Great House rebellion he feared. But if he convinced the Harkonnens to attack the Atreides, supplied them with secret support, everyone would see it as just another round in a 10,000-year feud. Other houses might deplore the violence, but they wouldn't unite against it. And when the Atreides were destroyed, the Emperor would have eliminated his most dangerous potential rival while the Harkonnens took all the blame. The trap was elegant. Take Arrakis away from the Harkonnens, who'd held it for 80 years, and give it to the Atreides. The Harkonnens would be furious, desperate to reclaim their most profitable fief. The Atreides would be thrilled to finally control the spice, to gain the wealth that had always eluded them on Caladan. But Arrakis is a trap. The planet is harsh. The native Fremen are dangerous. The logistics of spice harvesting are incredibly complex. The Atreides would be vulnerable during the transition, stretched thin trying to secure a planet they didn't understand. And in that moment of vulnerability, the Harkonnens would strike with the full weight of 5 Sardaukar legions hidden among their forces. Duke Leto knew it was a trap. His mentat Thufir Hawat calculated the probabilities and warned him explicitly. His master of assassins reported signs of unusual Harkonnen military buildup. His concubine, Jessica, though constrained by Bene Gesserit loyalties, did what she could to prepare him for what was coming. Leto knew, and he went to Arrakis anyway, because refusing an imperial order to change fiefs would be tantamount to rebellion. Sometimes the only choice is between certain disaster and probable disaster. And you choose probable disaster because at least it offers a chance. The siege of Arrakeen, when it came, was brutally efficient. The Harkonnens struck with overwhelming force. They'd corrupted Duke Leto's suck doctor, Wellington Yue, driving him to betray his oaths through a combination of torture and false hope regarding his captured wife. They infiltrated the Atreides household, disabled shields at the crucial moment, and hit the fortress with everything they had. The Sardaukar, pretending to be elite Harkonnen troops, cut through the Atreides defenders with terrifying efficiency. Duke Leto died trying to kill the Baron, a poison gas capsule hidden in his tooth, ready to release the moment he bit down. Thufir Hawat was captured, eventually forced into service to the Harkonnens, spending years believing that Lady Jessica had been the traitor who enabled the attack. Gurney Halleck, the War Master, escaped into the desert, eventually joining a smuggler crew, certain that everyone else he loved had died in the massacre. And Paul and Jessica fled into the deep desert, finding refuge among the Fremen, beginning this transformation that would eventually make Paul into Muad'Dib, the prophet warrior who would destroy House Harkonnen and seize the imperial throne. The feud that began at the Battle of Corrin 10,000 years earlier ended in a single day on Arrakis. Paul Atreides killed Feyd-Rautha Harkonnen in ritual combat. The Baron died, drowned in the water of life by Paul's sister Alia, a child whose consciousness had been awakened in the womb by Jessica's transformation into a Reverend Mother. The Harkonnen fortress on Giadi Prime was seized. The Harkonnen holdings were redistributed, and House Harkonnen itself ceased to exist as an independent power, reduced to nothing in the span of a few years. But here's what makes the ending of the feud so tragic. Paul didn't want revenge. He'd been trained as a mentat, taught to think rationally, to calculate costs and benefits. He understood that the feud had consumed too many lives already, that perpetuating it served no purpose beyond satisfying ancient hate. But he also understood that he needed the Fremen, needed their fanatical loyalty, and they demanded vengeance for their Muad'Dib. So Paul gave them House Harkonnen's destruction, even though he knew that revenge was just another form of the trap that had killed his father. The feud between Atreides and Harkonnen wasn't just a personal conflict between two families. It was a structural feature of the Imperium, a way for the Emperor to keep powerful houses distracted and divided. As long as Atreides and Harkonnen were fighting each other, neither could threaten the throne. The Emperor exploited this feud for his own purposes, and in doing so, he created the conditions for his own downfall. Because when you back someone like Duke Leto Atreides into a corner, when you kill him and scatter his house, you might just create something far more dangerous than an overly popular duke.
you might create a prophet with an army of religious fanatics willing to burn the galaxy for him. Other notable great houses. While the Atreides Harkonnen feud dominates Dune's narrative, the known universe contains dozens of other great houses, each with their own histories, specializations, and roles in the Imperium's political structure. Some of these houses are ancient, their bloodlines stretching back before the Butlerian Jihad. Others rose more recently, earning great house status through military conquest, economic success, or simply outlasting more powerful rivals who fell. House Carino, of course, stands above all others. They've held the imperial throne for over 10,000 years, an unbroken dynasty that began when Feuds Carino declared himself the first Padishah emperor after the Butlerian Jihad. The Carino power base rests on three foundations: their control of the Sardaukar, the most fearsome military force in human space; their plurality ownership of Chom, which gives them enormous economic leverage; and the sheer weight of 10 millennia of tradition that makes their rules seem natural and inevitable. Shaddam Carino IV inherited a throne that appeared unshakable, but he was haunted by insecurity. He had no sons, only 5 daughters, which created succession anxiety in a culture that strongly preferred male heirs. His most capable daughter, Princess Irulan, was brilliant and ambitious, but tradition dictated she'd have to marry someone else, potentially creating a rival dynasty. His cousin, Count Hasimir Fenring, served as his closest advisor, a genetic eunuch whose inability to father children made him safe to trust completely, or so Shaddam believed. Shaddam's greatest fear was being overshadowed, being seen as a weak emperor while stronger personalities commanded loyalty in the Landsraad. Duke Leto Atreides represented this fear made flesh. Here was a man who governed justly, commanded genuinely loyal troops, and could potentially challenge for the throne if the great houses united behind him. This fear drove Shaddam to make his greatest mistake, allying with Baron Harkonnen to destroy House Atreides. In eliminating his rival, Shaddam created Muad'Dib, and Muad'Dib destroyed him, far more thoroughly than Duke Leto ever could have. After Paul seized the throne, Princess Irulan became his wife in a political marriage that gave him Carino legitimacy. But Paul never consummated the marriage, remaining faithful to his Fremen concubine Chani, denying Irulan the children who might have continued her bloodline on the throne. Shaddam himself was exiled to the prison planet Salusa Secundus, forced to watch as a desert prophet wore the imperial crown that had belonged to his family for 10,000 years. House Rechace once stood as one of the great house's technological leaders, competing with the secretive factories of Ix in creating sophisticated machinery that didn't cross the line into thinking machines. They pioneered much of the personal shield technology that revolutionized combat, making projectile weapons useless and returning humanity to blade fighting. They developed suspensor technology that let even the morbidly obese Baron Harkonnen float through the air. They created systems and devices that kept the Imperium functioning
despite the prohibition on computers. But House Rechace fell on hard times. Their rivalry with Ix eventually led to economic decline, their market share eroding, their Chome directorships lost one by one. By the time of Duke Leto's generation, House Rechace retained Great House status more through historical momentum than current power. Duke Leto's wife, Lady Helena Rechace, came from this declining house. Her family saw the marriage as a way to gain protection and resources from the Atreides. Leto saw it as a way to gain a Chome directorship. Neither party got quite what they wanted from the arrangement, and the marriage was reportedly cold, though they maintained appearances for political necessity. House Ginaz achieved fame through their Swordmaster Academy, training the finest blade fighters in the known universe. Graduates of the Ginaz School served in nearly every great house, prized for their combat abilities and their loyalty once bonded to a house. Duke Leto's War Master Duncan Idaho trained on Ginaz before entering Atreides' service, as did Gurney Halleck. The reputation of Ginaz swordmasters was such that merely having one in your service conveyed prestige and deterred potential attackers. But House Ginaz made the mistake of feuding with House Moritani, a great house known for their willingness to violate the spirit of the Great Convention, even while technically adhering to its letter. The Moritani-Ginaz conflict escalated across generations, conducted as a war of assassins that grew increasingly vicious. Eventually, House Moritani managed to destroy House Ginaz so completely that the Swordmaster Academy itself had to close for a time, the teaching lineages broken, the traditions nearly lost. It was one of the more tragic examples of how Canley could destroy even the most respected institutions. House Moritani, for their part, demonstrated the dark side of the Great House system. They maintained their status through intimidation and savage responses to any perceived slight. They developed a reputation for taking feuds too far, for targeting not just the noble families they fought, but their retainers, their allies, even their populations. The Landsraad tolerated them because they technically operated within the rules, but few houses trusted them, and most avoided any interaction that might spark a feud. House Ikaz represented another model entirely. They were known for their artistry, their cultural refinement, their production of luxury goods that wealthy nobles across the Imperium desired. Ikaz fogwood furniture, with its grain that seemed to shift and change in different light, commanded astronomical prices. Ikazi artists created sculptures and paintings that decorated the finest palaces. But this cultural sophistication didn't make them weak. House Ikaz maintained skilled military forces and conducted their own wars of assassins when necessary, proving that appreciation for beauty and capacity for violence weren't mutually exclusive. House Furnius ruled Ix, the hidden technological powerhouse that rivaled even the Tale Laxu in creating sophisticated machinery. Ix operated under special dispensation from the Spacing Guild and the Emperor,
allowed to push closer to the boundaries of what constituted thinking machines than any other house dared. Ixian technology was everywhere: manufacturing systems, communication devices, ships, weapons. But Ix's power made them targets. Shortly before the events of Dune, House Vernius was destroyed in a coup orchestrated by the Tleilaxu with Imperial backing, demonstrating that even houses that seemed essential to the Imperium's functioning could be destroyed when they became too independent. The Tleilaxu themselves occupied a strange position. They weren't exactly great house in the traditional sense, operating more as a collective entity built around their genetic manipulation abilities and their disturbing face dancer spies, who could perfectly imitate any human. The Tleilaxu were pariahs, hated and feared for their willingness to violate taboos around human genetic manipulation. But they were also indispensable, providing services no one else could, including growing golas, artificial humans created from the cells of dead people. The Imperium needed them too much to destroy them, so they persisted, isolated and detested, but ultimately untouchable. House Ordos appears in some histories as operating primarily in the Sigma Draconis system, involved in the spice trade through less legitimate channels. They were known for espionage, for sabotage, for tactics that stayed just barely within legal boundaries. Where other houses maintained armies of soldiers, House Ordos invested heavily in spies and saboteurs. They understood that sometimes the most effective way to destroy an enemy wasn't through open combat, but through economic warfare and carefully orchestrated social collapse. These various houses created a patchwork of competing interests, alliances, and feuds that kept the Imperium in constant low-level conflict. At any given time, a dozen wars of assassins might be active. 2 or 3 houses engaged in formal conly. Countless others maneuvering for advantage through the Landsraad, or Chom. The Emperor encouraged this chaos, understanding that a united Landsraad could potentially overthrow him, but that a divided one posed no threat to the throne. What unified all these houses, despite their conflicts, was the Fafreluches, that rigid class structure that ensured everyone knew their place. A noble from even a minor house outranked any commoner, no matter how wealthy or talented the commoner might be. Within the nobility, great houses outranked minor houses. Older bloodlines outranked newer ones, and specific honors and titles created infinite gradations of status. The entire system was designed to prevent social mobility, to keep power concentrated in the hands of families who'd held it for generations or millennia. This rigidity had consequences. It meant that brilliant individuals born to common parents would never reach their full potential. Their talents wasted because the society couldn't accommodate them in positions of real authority. It meant that incompetent nobles could maintain their positions through bloodline alone, causing suffering for everyone under their governance. It meant that change, when it came, typically came through violence rather than reform, because the system provided no peaceful mechanism for redistributing power. Paul Atreides' jihad, the religious war that consumed the galaxy after he seized the imperial throne,
was partly a revolution against this rigidity. The Fremen didn't care about ancient bloodlines or traditional hierarchies. They followed Muad'Dib because he proved
Himself in the desert, because he led them to victory, because his legend transcended any considerations of noble birth. When Paul's Fremen armies conquered world after world, they disrupted the Fafreluches wherever they went, installing leaders based on religious loyalty rather than ancient privilege. The great houses never forgave Paul for this violation of the social order, even more than they hated him for toppling House Carino. Governance in practice, the daily reality. We've talked about the grand politics, the feuds spanning millennia, the wars of assassins and Landsraad intrigues. But what did governance actually look like for a great house? What did Duke Leto do every day on Caladan? How did the Baron Harkonnen actually run Giadi Prime? The daily realities of noble rule shaped the Imperium as much as the dramatic conflicts that dominate the histories. A great house head was simultaneously monarch, CEO, military commander, judge, and father figure to their population. The scope of responsibility was immense. You governed not just a city or a country, but an entire planet, sometimes multiple planets, with populations in the millions or billions. Every decision about resource allocation, legal codes, military deployment, trade policy, all of these flowed from the noble house and its administrative apparatus. Duke Leto maintained what the histories call a disciplined and efficient organization built on personal loyalty. His household included several key positions that every great house needed to function. Thufir Hawat served as Master of Assassins, responsible for both protecting the Duke from threats and conducting covert operations against enemies. This meant maintaining networks of spies and informants, analyzing intelligence, planning raids and counter-raids, staying 3 moves ahead of rival houses' plots. Hawat's Mentat abilities made him extraordinarily effective at this work, calculating probabilities and connections that ordinary humans would miss. Gurney Halleck served as War Master, commanding the Atreides military forces. This meant training troops, planning defensive strategies, leading forces in combat when necessary, maintaining readiness for threats that could come at any moment. The War Master also worked closely with the House Sword Masters, those elite fighters trained on Ginaz, who served as personal bodyguards to the Duke and his family. Duncan Idaho held this position before his death and Gola rebirth, one of the most skilled fighters in the known universe. Wellington Yueh was the house's Suk Doctor, bearing the diamond tattoo on his forehead that marked him as bound by imperial conditioning to never take human life. Every great house employed at least one Suk Doctor, because their conditioning made them trustworthy for treating nobles who lived under constant threat of poisoning and assassination. The tragedy of Yueh was that even imperial conditioning could be broken if someone found the right leverage. In his case, the capture and torture of his wife by Baron Harkonnen. Beyond these key positions, the Atreides household included hundreds of other essential personnel. Stewards who managed the Duke's finances, keeping track of income from taxes,
chon dividends, trade agreements, while also tracking expenses for military maintenance, household operations, and political obligations. Administrators who oversaw the actual governance of Caledon, implementing the Duke's policies, resolving disputes, ensuring the planetary economy remained healthy. Military officers who commanded garrisons, trained new recruits, maintained equipment and fortifications. The Duke himself spent his days moving between these various responsibilities. Morning might be devoted to military matters, reviewing reports from his war master, making decisions about troop deployments or training priorities. Afternoon could focus on economic issues, meeting with stewards to discuss crop yields on Caledon, examining trade proposals, considering requests for tax adjustments. Evening often involved political work, communicating with other great houses, attending Landsraad assemblies via communicator, meeting with ambassadors and representatives, and running through everything, constantly, was the requirement to maintain appearances. A great house's reputation mattered almost as much as its actual power. Duke Leto had to appear strong to discourage attacks, appear just to maintain loyalty, appear wealthy enough to be worth allying with, but not so wealthy as to provoke jealousy. Every public appearance was calculated, every statement measured for how it would be interpreted by other houses, by the Emperor, by the Spacing Guild and the Bene Gesserit. The Baron Harkonnen's approach to governance differed dramatically from Duke Leto's, but the underlying structure remained similar. The Baron also employed a Mentat assassin, the twisted Peter de Vries, who planned the more elaborate schemes that the Harkonnen reputation rested on. He maintained military commanders, administrators, spies, all the infrastructure necessary to govern. But where the Atreides built loyalty through justice and mutual respect, the Harkonnens ruled through fear and greed. On Giddy Prime, the Baron encouraged a culture of casual cruelty. Citizens informed on their neighbors, hoping to gain favor or avoid suspicion. Officials competed to show their ruthlessness, understanding that the Baron rewarded those who could extract maximum wealth from minimum resources. The planet became an industrial nightmare, its people ground down by labor that would have been impossible without constant fear of punishment for insufficient productivity. This created tremendous wealth in the short term. Giddy Prime's industrial output rivaled any planet in the Imperium, except perhaps Ix. Combined with the spice revenues from Arrakis, the Harkonnens became one of the richest houses in existence. But it also created instability. The population hated their rulers. If the Harkonnen military forces ever weakened, if protection faltered even momentarily, the entire planet might erupt in rebellion. The Baron had to maintain overwhelming force just to keep his own people from destroying him. Succession planning occupied enormous amounts of every great house's attention. The bloodline had to continue. The family name had to persist across generations. This meant careful attention to marriages, to producing heirs, to training those heirs to eventually take over governance. A weak or incompetent heir could destroy in a single generation what took centuries to build. Duke Leto's situation was delicate. His only son Paul was born to Jessica, his concubine rather than his wife.
This made Paul technically illegitimate, at least by the strictest reading of noble inheritance laws. But Leto had no children with his actual wife, Lady Helena Riches, and the marriage was so cold that none seemed likely. In practice, everyone understood that Paul would inherit the duchy, but the ambiguity created vulnerability that enemies could potentially exploit. The Baron Harkonnen had no children of his own, unusual for a great house head. His heirs were his nephews, Glossu Raban and Fade Routha. The Baron's plans called for Raban to mismanage Arrakis so badly that when Fade replaced him, the population would be grateful for even marginal improvement. Then Fade would rule the spice world, accumulate enormous wealth and power, and eventually inherit House Harkonnen itself. It was a characteristically Byzantine plan that demonstrated how governance for the Harkonnens was always subservient to scheming. Taxation required constant calibration. Tax too heavily and you impoverish your population, reduce their productivity, potentially spark rebellion. Tax too lightly and you lack the resources to maintain military forces, to participate in Landsraad politics, to project the power that keeps your house relevant. The optimal tax rate varied by planet, by population wealth, by economic conditions, and changing circumstances required constant adjustment. Caladan's economy, based primarily on sustainable agriculture and fishing, generated steady but not spectacular revenues. The planet supported itself easily and provided enough surplus for Duke Leto to maintain respectable military forces and participate in Landsraad politics. But it never made the Atreides truly rich, never gave them the overwhelming economic power that comes from controlling strategic resources. This was part of why the offer of Arrakis seemed so attractive, despite the obvious dangers. Controlling the spice would transform House Atreides from a respected but moderately wealthy house into an economic powerhouse. The Baron's taxation of Arrakis represented the opposite extreme. He squeezed the planet mercilessly, extracting every bit of wealth possible with minimal reinvestment. His approach assumed that Arrakis was temporary, that eventually the Emperor would reassign the spice fief to someone else or revoke it entirely. Therefore, the goal was maximum short-term extraction rather than sustainable long-term development. This meant brutalizing the population, degrading infrastructure, accepting high costs in terms of human suffering in exchange for immediate profits. Justice administration formed another daily responsibility for Great House leaders. Citizens brought disputes that lower officials couldn't resolve. Criminals committed crimes serious enough to require noble judgment. Traditions and laws required interpretation and enforcement. A just ruler like Duke Leto spent significant time hearing cases, trying to ensure fair outcomes, building a reputation for wisdom and even-handedness. An unjust ruler like the Baron typically delegated such matters to subordinates, with instructions to maximize revenue through fines and confiscations, while using punishment as public entertainment and deterrent. The Atreides' approach to justice on Caladan emphasized proportionality and consistency. Similar crimes received similar punishments regardless of the offender's status. The Duke made himself accessible to petitioners, maintaining the tradition that any citizen could bring a case directly to the ruling house if they believed lower officials had treated them unjustly. This accessibility cost time and energy, but built tremendous loyalty. The
the sense that the Duke genuinely cared about his people's welfare, rather than viewing them as merely resources to exploit. Religious administration also fell under noble governance, though the Imperium's religious landscape was complex. The Orange Catholic Bible provided a syncretic foundation that most citizens nominally adhered to, combining elements from Earth's ancient religions into a faith structure that the Commission of Ecumenical Translators had created centuries after the Butlerian Jihad. But local variations flourished, and wise nobles learned to accommodate religious sensibilities rather than fighting them. The Fremen of Arrakis represented an extreme case. Their religion, built around water conservation, desert survival, and prophecies about a messiah figure who would transform their world, was so deeply embedded in their culture that separating religious from practical matters became impossible. Duke Leto, in his brief time on Arrakis, tried to understand the Fremen, to find ways to ally with them rather than suppress them. This was the Atreides way, seeking cooperation where possible. The Harkonnens, predictably, had simply tried to exterminate the Fremen or drive them deeper into the desert, viewing them as pests rather than potential allies. Every great house maintained communication networks that spanned their holdings and extended throughout the Imperium. This meant regular exchanges with other houses, with the Landsraad, with Chom, with the Spacing Guild. Messages arrived constantly, requiring response, interpretation, decisions about what to ignore and what to act upon. The volume of correspondence alone required dedicated staff just to manage the flow of information. And underlying everything, always, was the knowledge that enemies were watching, were probing for weaknesses, were planning attacks that might come tomorrow or 10 years from now. The daily life of a great house leader combined the responsibilities of governing with constant vigilance against threats from without and within. Paranoia wasn't mental illness in this context. It was survival instinct. The recognition that genuine threats surrounded you at all times. The fragile balance. Why the system persisted. After examining the great houses, the Landsraad, the feuds and governance structures, one question remains. Why did this system persist for 10,000 years? What prevented revolution, reform, or complete collapse under the weight of its own contradictions? The answer lies in understanding the incentive structures that bound everyone to the existing order, even those who might benefit from changing it. The three-point civilization, that unstable tripod of Emperor, Landsraad, and Spacing Guild, worked precisely because it was unstable. Each leg of the tripod needed the others to continue functioning. The Emperor needed the Landsraad's economic resources and their acceptance of his legitimacy. The Landsraad needed the Emperor to prevent any single great house from dominating the others. The Spacing Guild needed both to maintain the interstellar commerce that generated revenues for melange purchases. This interdependence created a system where no single entity could change the rules without potentially destroying everything. The Emperor couldn't simply conquer the great houses because their combined military strength matched his Sardaukar, and attempting such conquest would unite them against him. The great houses couldn't overthrow the Emperor without the Spacing Guild's cooperation, and the Guild maintained absolute neutrality in political conflicts. The Guild couldn't change the economic structure without risking its monopoly on space travel, which depended on maintaining good relationships with everyone. The Faferluches, that rigid class structure, persisted because it benefited not just the nobles but also the upper tiers of common society. Wealthy merchants, skilled artisans, successful traders. These people occupied a comfortable niche in the existing system. They had more to lose from revolution than to gain from it. Yes, they could never become nobles themselves, but they could become wealthy, respected, secure. Revolution would threaten that security, might elevate people below them, might cost them everything they'd built. So they supported the system, became its defenders, helped suppress any challenges to the established order. The prohibition on thinking machines, enforced through religious fervor since the Butlerian Jihad, also stabilized the system. Without computers, coordination of mass movements became extraordinarily difficult. Without automated communications and surveillance, revolutionary organizing required face-to-face contact, making it vulnerable to infiltration by the house's spy networks. The technological limitations imposed by the Great Convention inadvertently helped preserve the feudal structure by preventing the kind of coordination that might enable systemic change. The Spacing Guild's monopoly on interstellar travel gave them ultimate veto power over any attempt to reform the Imperium. If the great houses tried to unite against the Emperor, the Guild could refuse to transport their troops. If the Emperor attempted too aggressive a consolidation of power, the Guild could limit his forces' mobility. The Guild's neutrality was real, but it was neutrality in service of preserving the status quo that kept them wealthy and powerful. The Bene Gesserit added another layer of stability. Through their breeding program, their placement of sisters in every great house, their subtle manipulations across generations, they worked to guide humanity toward their own long-term goals. They didn't want revolution or collapse. They wanted controlled evolution, gradual change that moved toward their vision of humanity's future. When disruptions threatened, the sisterhood often worked behind the scenes to restore balance, to ensure the three-point civilization continued functioning. Most importantly, the system persisted because the alternatives looked worse to most people involved. Yes, the great houses feuded constantly. Yes, the emperor was often tyrannical. Yes, the common people had no voice in governance. But the alternative might be the kind of total war that had nearly destroyed humanity during the Butlerian Jihad. The alternative might be chaos, fragmentation, isolated worlds sliding back toward pre-space technology. The alternative might be conquest by something genuinely alien, like the Tleilaxu, or even the mysterious forces beyond the edges of known space. Better the devil you know than the devil you don't became the Imperium's operating principle. Better an unjust system that at least maintains order than the uncertainties of revolution. Better ancient feuds conducted according to established rules than unrestricted warfare that might escalate to atomic weapons and human extinction. This conservative bias,
This preference for stability over justice, for order over freedom, for tradition over innovation, it characterized the Imperium for its entire existence, and it's what made Paul Atreides so dangerous. Because Paul didn't just want to reform the system or take the Emperor's place within the existing structure. His prescient visions showed him that the entire edifice was unsustainable, that humanity had stagnated, that only tremendous upheaval could break the patterns that were leading towards species-wide extinction. Paul's jihad, that religious war that killed billions across the known universe, was his attempt to shatter the comfortable stability that was killing humanity through stagnation. He understood that evolution requires stress, that species don't change when they're comfortable. So he made humanity profoundly uncomfortable, burned away the feudal structures that had persisted for 10 millennia, scattered the genetic diversity that the Bene Gesserit had been carefully cultivating, and set in motion changes that would echo across thousands of years. Whether this made him hero or villain remains the central question of Frank Herbert's Dune series. From one perspective, Paul destroyed a system that had maintained human civilization across thousands of worlds for 10,000 years. From another, he saved humanity from extinction by forcing it to evolve. The great houses and the Landsraad that bound them together represented humanity at its most organized and most stagnant. And sometimes Herbert seems to suggest stagnation is a greater danger than chaos. Closing reflections. We've journeyed through the intricate political machinery of Frank Herbert's Imperium, exploring the grand halls of power where dynasties rise and fall, where feuds burn across millennia, where the fate of worlds hangs on single votes in the Landsraad Assembly. We've examined the structures that bound together civilizations spanning thousands of worlds, and the personalities who operated within those structures, both maintaining and subverting them. The genius of Herbert's political world-building lies in how thoroughly he thought through the implications of his feudal future concept. This isn't just medieval Europe with spaceships, though that's the starting template. It's a fully realized system where every piece serves a purpose, where the contradictions and tensions create the drama rather than breaking the believability. The Landsraad makes sense as a way to check imperial power. CHOAM makes sense as a way to bind competing interests together through shared profit. The Spacing Guild's monopoly makes sense as leverage that transcends traditional power structures. The Great Convention's rules make sense as survival mechanisms for a species that nearly destroyed itself. And the feuds, those ancient hatreds that consume generation after generation, they make sense too, in a way that's simultaneously alien and deeply human. We like to think we're rational, that we'd let go of grudges rather than let them define our lives. But history shows us otherwise. real families have maintained feuds across centuries. Real nations have gone to war over insults delivered by leaders long dead. The Atreides-Harkonnen conflict, spanning 10,000 years from the Battle of Corran to Paul's confrontation with Feyd-Rautha, is barely an exaggeration of human behavior. It's our tribalism and capacity for multi-generational grudges projected into a far future where the stakes are planetary rather than merely national. What Herbert understood, what makes his political world-building so compelling, is that systems of government aren't just abstract structures. They're composed of people. People with ambitions and fears, loyalties and hatreds, principles and pragmatic compromises. Duke Leto Atreides wasn't just a game piece marked noble ruler. He was a man, trying to govern justly while protecting his family, trying to maintain his principles while surviving in a system that punished principled behavior, trying to prepare his son for leadership, while hoping Paul would never have to face the hardest choices that leadership demanded. The Baron Harkonnen wasn't just villain. He was a brilliant strategist who understood power dynamics with remarkable clarity, who built an economic empire through sheer force of will and absolute ruthlessness, who represented what human beings become when they prioritize victory over virtue, when they decide that the ends justify any means. The Baron was monstrous, but he was effective. And Herbert doesn't shy away from showing how effectiveness can flourish in the absence of morality. Emperor Shaddam IV wasn't just an obstacle for Paul to overcome. He was a man born to ultimate power who felt that power slipping away, who watched younger, more dynamic personalities eclipse him in popularity and respect, who made desperate decisions trying to secure a throne that had belonged to his family for 10,000 years. His tragedy was believing that eliminating Duke Leto would solve his problems, when in reality, it created Paul Muad'Dib, a threat infinitely more dangerous than the popular Duke ever could have been. The great houses themselves, with their retainers and soldiers, their mentats and swordmasters, their elaborate courts and shadowy assassins, they represent something fundamental about human organization. We form groups. We develop loyalties to those groups. We compete with other groups for resources and status. We pass down stories about our group's glories and grievances, and we train our children to continue the competition, to carry forward the feuds and alliances that defined our own lives. The great houses are this tendency elevated to a civilizational scale, where the groups command planets, and the competitions reshape the political landscape of the known universe. But Herbert also shows us the cost of this system, the billions of ordinary people who have no voice in how they're governed, who live and die according to the whims of nobles they'll never meet, who get caught in the crossfire of feuds they don't understand and wars of assassins they never agreed to. The talented individuals whose potential is wasted because they were born to the wrong class. The resources squandered on maintaining ancient privileges rather than improving human welfare. The technological stagnation that comes from a culture that actively resists innovation and change. The Imperium that the great houses maintained for 10,000 years was stable, but it was the stability of a society that had stopped progressing that had achieved a comfortable equilibrium
and then refused to move beyond it. The prohibition on thinking machines, originally a necessary survival measure after the Butlerian Jihad, became an anchor that prevented development of new technologies that might disrupt the existing power structure. The Faufreluches, that rigid class system, prevented social mobility that might threaten noble privilege. The three-point civilization created a balance of power so perfect that no one could change anything without risking everything. And into this perfect, stable, stagnant system came Paul Atreides, a young man who could see the future, who understood that stability was a trap, that humanity needed upheaval to survive. Paul's prescient vision showed him the golden path, the narrow way through which humanity might avoid extinction. But walking that path required becoming a monster, required unleashing a jihad that would kill billions, required making himself into exactly the kind of tyrant that his father would have despised. This is where Herbert's political world-building transcends mere background detail and becomes the thematic heart of his work. The great houses and their Landsraad, the feuds and the governance structures, Chom and the Spacing Guild, all of it represents humanity's attempt to create order, to establish systems that will protect us from chaos and self-destruction. And Herbert shows us that these systems, successful as they are at maintaining order, ultimately threaten us in different ways. The order becomes oppression. The stability becomes stagnation. The survival mechanisms become traps. Paul understood this. He saw that the Imperium couldn't continue as it was, that humanity needed to be shaken out of its comfortable patterns. But he also saw that he would become history's greatest villain in the process of saving the species. The great houses that had governed for 10,000 years would be destroyed or transformed beyond recognition. The careful political balances would be shattered. The old certainties would burn in the fires of religious war, and Paul himself would become the tyrant Messiah, worshipped and feared in equal measure, trapped by the forces he'd unleashed, just as completely as the Imperium had been trapped by its own stability. The system of great houses that Herbert created wasn't just clever science fiction world building. It was a meditation on power and legitimacy, on tradition and change, on the structures we create to protect ourselves, and how those structures eventually constrain us. Every great house, from Atreides to Harkonnen, from Carino to the smallest minor houses hoping to rise in status, they all operated within a system they didn't create, playing by rules established millennia before their births, pursuing goals that seemed natural and inevitable because they'd never known any alternative. Duke Leto couldn't simply decide to govern Caladan as a democracy. The Faufreluches wouldn't allow it, and the other great houses would view such innovation as dangerous, potentially threatening to their own power. Baron Harkonnen couldn't decide that accumulating wealth through brutality wasn't worth the cost to human dignity. His position in the Imperium depended on being wealthy and powerful, and he'd learned that brutality was effective at generating both. Emperor Shaddam couldn't simply choose to rule benevolently and accept whatever popularity accrued to potential rivals. The throne demanded that he maintain dominance, that he crush threats before they could mature, that he prioritize power over principle. The system shaped the people within it, limited their choices,
channeled their ambitions into approved directions, and the system perpetuated itself across 10,000 years precisely because it was so effective at shaping the people who might otherwise have changed it. This is Herbert's deepest insight about power, that systems of governance aren't just ways of organizing society. They're machines for reproducing themselves, for ensuring that each new generation accepts the legitimacy of the existing order and works to maintain it, until someone comes along who can see beyond the system, who perceives alternatives that the system has trained everyone else not to imagine. Paul Atreides had this ability, not just because of his genetic inheritance and his Bene Gesserit training, but because his prescient visions let him see the consequences of continuing on the current path. He saw the extinction of humanity, the dead end that 10,000 years of stable feudalism was leading toward, and he chose to break the system, to burn down the structures that humanity had so carefully maintained, because he understood that sometimes destruction is the only path to transformation. The great houses resisted this transformation with everything they had. They'd built comfortable positions within the existing system. They understood how to operate in the world of Canley and wars of assassins, of Landsraad politics and Chom maneuvering. Paul's jihad destroyed the familiar rules, replacing them with religious fanaticism that didn't respect ancient privileges or carefully negotiated balances. A Fremen warrior charging in the name of Muad'Dib didn't care about your house's 10,000-year pedigree. The spice monopoly that had made the emperor wealthy beyond measure didn't help when Paul controlled the spice and used it as a weapon to force compliance. By the time Paul's son, Leto II, implemented the Golden Path in its final form, becoming the God Emperor who would rule for 3,000 years, the old system of great houses had been transformed beyond recognition. Leto II scattered the human genetic lines that the Bene Gesserit had spent millennia carefully cultivating. He forced humanity into patterns of behavior that ensured survival at the cost of freedom. He became the ultimate tyrant, the absolute ruler that the three-point civilization had been designed to prevent. And yet Herbert suggests that even this tyranny was necessary, that humanity's survival required the breaking of the comfortable feudal structures, the scattering of the concentrated power, the forced evolution that only profound oppression could achieve. It's a disturbing vision, one that questions whether freedom and survival are ultimately compatible, whether species that value individual liberty can persist across deep time. The great houses of the Landsraad in Herbert's vision represent humanity's attempt to create a sustainable civilization through carefully balanced power structures and ritualized conflict. For 10,000 years, the attempt succeeded. The Imperium maintained itself across thousands of worlds, preserved human civilization against the chaos that might have fragmented it into isolated planets and eventual extinction. The cost was stagnation, was injustice, was the waste of human potential in service of maintaining ancient privileges. But it worked, until it stopped working, until the very stability that had preserved humanity became the threat that would destroy it. This is the paradox at the heart of Herbert's political world-building. The
The great houses were simultaneously humanity's salvation and its prison. The Landsraad was both the mechanism that prevented tyranny and the structure that prevented progress. The feuds that consumed so many lives also provided channels for controlled conflict that prevented total war. The rigid class structure that oppressed billions also provided stability across millennia. Every strength contained within it a corresponding weakness. Every solution to one problem, creating new problems that would eventually demand their own solutions. And perhaps that's the ultimate lesson we can draw from Herbert's examination of the great houses and their governance. That there are no perfect systems, no structures that solve all problems without creating new ones. That humanity muddles through, creates institutions that work for a while, then adapts or transforms or replaces them when they stop working. That the feuds we inherit from our ancestors shape us, even as we tell ourselves we're rational beings making free choices. That power, once concentrated, resists redistribution with every tool available to it. That sometimes the only way forward is through destruction and chaos, even knowing the terrible cost that transformation demands. The known universe that Herbert created, with its great houses and Landsraad, its Canley and Wars of Assassins, its Spacing Guild and Chom, its Emperor and religious orders. It feels real because it's built on deep understanding of how power actually works. The details are exotic. The technology is far future. The scale is interstellar. But the fundamental dynamics are human, recognizable. Extensions of patterns we can see in our own world and our own history. We may never face decisions about declaring Canley against rival houses or maneuvering for Chom directorships, but we face analogous choices about when to compromise and when to stand firm, about how to balance principle against pragmatism, about whether to maintain comfortable systems or risk the chaos of transformation. We live within structures we didn't create, playing by rules we didn't write, pursuing goals that seem natural because we've never known alternatives. And occasionally someone comes along who can see beyond the system, who imagines possibilities that the rest of us have been trained not to perceive. Frank Herbert's examination of the great houses gives us a framework for thinking about these questions, for understanding how power operates and perpetuates itself, for recognizing the costs and benefits of the systems we live within. It's world building that serves a deeper purpose than mere background detail. It's political philosophy disguised as science fiction, raising questions about legitimacy and justice, tradition and change, stability and progress that remain relevant regardless of whether humanity ever spreads across the stars. The feuds may span 10,000 years in Herbert's universe, where ours might only span generations or centuries. The stakes may involve entire planets, where ours involve nations or communities. But the underlying patterns are the same. We are, all of us, heirs to feuds we didn't start, participants in systems we didn't design, shaped by structures that seem permanent until the moment they shatter. Understanding the great houses of Dune helps us understand ourselves, the institutions we've created, and the possibilities for transformation that always exist, waiting for someone with sufficient vision and courage to act on them. And with that reflection on the political machinery that Herbert built, on the great houses that governed the known universe for 10,000 years, until Paul Atreides tore it all down, we reach the end of this journey. We've explored the Landsraad and its voting structures, Chome and economic warfare, Canley and the War of Assassins. We've examined the Atreides-Harkonnen feud from its origins at the Battle of Corran to its bloody conclusion on Arrakis. We've looked at governance in practice, at the daily realities of ruling entire planets, at the structures that preserved human civilization, and the costs that preservation demanded. If you've made it this far through this exploration of Dune's political structures, thank you for your time and attention. If you found this deep dive into Herbert's world-building valuable, I'd encourage you to like this video and subscribe to the channel. There's so much more to explore in the worlds of science fiction. So many universes to examine. So many questions to pursue. Your support helps me continue creating this content, diving deep into the details that make these fictional worlds feel real and relevant. The great houses of the Landsraad, with all their feuds and governance structures, their ancient privileges and bitter conflicts, they're gone now in Herbert's timeline, transformed by Paul's jihad and eventually by the God Emperor's 3,000-year reign. But the questions they raise about power and legitimacy, about tradition and change, about the structures we create to protect ourselves and how those structures eventually constrain us, those questions persist. They're as relevant to us living in our early 21st century as they were to the fictional nobles of Shaddam IV's Imperium. Sleep well, and may your own houses, whatever form they take, find wisdom in both tradition and transformation, both stability and change. Until next time, this has been Cryo Bay Logs, exploring the depths of science fiction's greatest universes. Good night.